Hello and welcome back. This video we're going to talk a little bit about some of the things that can go wrong during meiosis. And when something goes wrong in meiosis, what ends up happening is you either end up with a cell that ends up with too much genetic material or a cell that's missing genetic material. Either way can be detrimental to the organism. So it's really important that meiosis occurs properly, okay? And that process of chromosomes not separating correctly, the mechanism for that is called non-disjunction, okay? And that process of non-disjunction can occur either during meiosis 1 or during meiosis 2, okay? And I have both drawn up on the board here. The diagram is also in your PowerPoints, okay? So what we have here, if where non-disjunction occurs during meiosis 1, okay, we have a set of homologous pairs that fail to separate, okay? So we segregate the entire complex of homologous pairs to one cell. One cell ends up missing a set of chromosomes, okay? Meiosis 2 then, in this case, occurs normally, and we segregate each one of the sister chromatids into those cells. And what we end up with is where we had that homologous pair not separate, is we've got an extra chromosome there, okay? The other set of cells that's now lacking that chromosome, it's going to be missing one. So the way we denote that, it would be N+1, so it's haploid plus 1 chromosome, haploid minus 1 chromosome, okay? If that non-disjunction occurs during meiosis 2, all right, meiosis 1 occurs normally, we separate the homologous pairs. Now in this case, the sister chromatids don't separate, okay? Those sister chromatids don't separate. What that's going to do is that's going to segregate one extra chromosome into one of our gametes. One is going to be missing. Over here I have a normal meiosis 2 happening. These would be haploid cells, okay? So why this is important is because there are some clinical abnormalities that you'll come across that are associated or that are due to errors in meiosis, all right? The examples I have in the PowerPoints are Down syndrome, okay? And what happens with folks who have Down syndrome, they get an extra chromosome 21, all right? So you'll also see that Down syndrome referred to as trisomy 21. That's why, because those folks who have Down syndrome have 3 copies of chromosome 21 instead of just 2 copies, which would be normal, all right, for a diploid organism, all right? That's an example of a non-disjunction that allows for a viable offspring, all right? And if you look at that karyotype that I've got in the PowerPoints, chromosome 21 is a fairly small chromosome. So that's in part why that's not lethal. If you get a non-disjunction in some of the other chromosomes, which is entirely possible, you can have non-disjunctions happen with chromosome 13, chromosome 1, you can take your pick, okay? Those tend to not be viable because if you get too much information, the cell doesn't know how to handle it. And if you are lacking a chromosome 13, that's a lot of genetic information that is important for the running of the cells and the running of the organism, can't function correctly. So very often, the larger chromosomes result in lethalities, okay? Those would be combinations of egg and sperm of fertilized embryo that would not make it to term, potentially, all right? Down syndrome is one example of a non-disjunction that results in viable offspring, okay? The other examples of viable offspring involve non-disjunctions with the sex chromosomes. So oh goodness, I can spell chromosome. Let me get my rag. There we go. Chromosome. All right. So you can have either too much of one of the particular sex chromosomes. In the case of females, females can end up as XXX, all right? And in terms of phenotypes, or what they look like, having 3X chromosomes isn't terribly detrimental to a female. And that's because females undergo a process known as X inactivation. So what happens is that extra genetic material gets inactivated, kind of lays there dormant, and it's not a problem, okay? Alternatively, what you can have with a female is what's known as XO. O means you're missing one X chromosome. That gives rise to Turner syndrome. All right. This process can also happen with the male chromosome as well, the Y chromosome. So you can have a male that is XXY. So there's a non-disjunction in the X chromosome. The male gets 2 X chromosomes. This is known as, oops. We'll get this spelling thing down eventually. Once I do, I can retire. This is going to be Klinefelter syndrome. All right. Those individuals who have either Turner syndrome or Klinefelter syndrome do have some abnormalities associated with them. Women with Turner syndrome tend to have some heart abnormalities. They've got some webbing in the neck. They also tend to have a very specific type of stature. They tend to be short and kind of boxy, okay? Klinefelters, also that has an impact on men because of having that extra X chromosome. The X chromosome does become inactivated, however, it still causes some trouble, all right? So men who have Klinefelters tend to have trouble growing facial hair. Their genitals tend to be smaller than normal. And in the case of both Turner's and Klinefelter syndrome, because of that abnormal non-disjunction with the sex chromosomes, they tend to be infertile. All right, so they tend to not be able to reproduce. All right. The other option we can have with men can be XYY. All right, and XYY, kind of like being XXX for females. Doesn't seem to have any detrimental implications for males, all right? If you go back in the literature, or if you go back in time, back in the 1960s, 1970s, there were researchers who proposed that men who were XYY were actually more aggressive than an XY male, all right? But the data that they took with that were they checked the chromosome makeup of men who were in prison. So men in prison tend to have more aggressive personality types. That's probably what landed them in prison in the first place. But the thing is they did not take a very big sample of the population of men outside of prison, okay? It turns out there are plenty of men walking around who are XYY, who are perfectly normal, who have no idea that they're XYY, and are not more aggressive and are not going to end up in prison, okay? So this one, that correlation didn't turn out to be true, okay? So XYY tends to be okay, XXX for females tends to be okay. The other two do result in some syndromes, and I've got kind of an outline on those in the PowerPoints, all right? So that kind of wraps up our meiosis, mitosis, cell division chapter. If you have any questions, please let me know.